5 seconds of black. Then a sound. Not an explosion. Not a gunshot. Breathing dot, slow, controlled, measured breathing. The kind that only comes from a man who has trained himself to be afraid quietly. Because noise in this jungle is the last mistake you ever make dot. The year is 1968. The jungle is Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam, and somewhere in the darkness between the trees, in a tangle of wait a while, vines and chest-high elephant grass that smells of rot and rain, and something sweeter that you learn to recognize after your first week, and never forget after that. 4 Australian soldiers are lying absolutely still dot, not 400, not 40. 4.8 they have been lying in this exact position for 11 hours. They have not eaten. They have urinated into their own uniforms rather than risk the sound of movement. One of them has a leech the size of a thumb attached to the soft skin behind his left ear, and he has not reached up to remove it because the rustle of a hand against a collar in this silence would carry 30 meters, and there are people 30 meters away who are very interested in finding them dot. 318 North Vietnamese army soldiers are camped in the clearing ahead. Not an estimate. 318. Because the man who has been watching that camp for 4 days has counted them individually, the way a stockman counts cattle at muster. A regiment-level logistics hub. Ammunition. Weapons. Mortar tubes. Enough material to sustain a battalion offensive for 2 weeks dot. These 4 Australians found it by walking toward it in the dark. They have been watching it ever since dot. And now, in the last hour before dawn, the NVA security patrol has altered its route. Changed the interval. The man on point, Corporal Ray Simpson, 26 years old, from the western suburbs of Brisbane. A man who grew up hunting feral pigs in the scrub and who can tell the difference between a kangaroo moving through dry grass and a man trying to sound like one, knows with absolute certainty that the patrol is not changing its route randomly dot. They are being hunted dot. The radio operator touches the patrol. Commander on the shoulder. 1 tap. Enemy close. The commander does not speak. He raises 2 fingers, points left, then makes a slow rolling motion with his wrist. Every man in that patrol understands what comes next dot, not extraction, not retreat, not a frantic call for helicopter evacuation. Dot. They are going to turn around and walk directly toward the sound dot. This is the story of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment in Vietnam. The story of what 5 men with rifles and absolute silence can do to an army of tens of thousands. And the story of a tactic so aggressive, so psychologically devastating, so contrary to every instinct of self-preservation, that the North Vietnamese army eventually wrote a formal warning about it and distributed it to every company commander in their operational area dot. They told their soldiers, do not engage the Australians at night dot, which is exactly when the Australians preferred to work. To understand what the Australian SAS walked into in Vietnam, you need to understand what they were walking into dot, not just the jungle. Not just the heat that sits on your chest like a wet sandbag at 42 degrees and doesn't lift until past midnight. Not just the rain that falls for 6 hours straight and then stops with the sudden completeness of a tap being turned off, leaving the air so saturated that your clothes never dry, and the skin between your toes begins to look like it belongs to something that lives in water dot. You need to understand the People's Army of Vietnam dot. The North Vietnamese army was not an insurgency. By 1966, when Australian forces arrived in Phuoc Tuy Province, the NVA and its Viet Cong auxiliaries represented one of the most battle-hardened, tactically sophisticated light infantry forces on the face of the earth, operating on home terrain against a foreign military that, for all its technological superiority, was still learning the rules of a game the Vietnamese had been playing for 2,000 years dot. These were men who had been fighting continuously since 1945. Men who had defeated the French Empire at Dien Bien Phu, a fortified position that Paris had publicly called impregnable, by dragging heavy artillery up mountains in secret over months, then turning those guns on the fortress from elevations French doctrine had classified as unreachable. That victory had been 20 years ago. These soldiers had not been resting since dot. By the mid-1960s, the NVA could move a regiment-sized element, several thousand men with weapons and supplies, through dense triple canopy jungle at night, without lights, arriving at a coordinated attack position within minutes of schedule. They built underground cities beneath the jungle floor, field hospitals, machine shops capable of manufacturing weapons from scavenged materials, command centers that could absorb direct bomb hits and keep functioning. Their doctrine, refined by 2 decades of fighting technologically superior enemies, was elegant in its brutality. Never fight where your enemy's advantages apply. So close that the aircraft cannot bomb you without bombing their own people. Fight at knife range where a B-52 is irrelevant. Then disappear before the response arrives. In Phuoc Tuy Province, 2 main force NVA regiments operated with near-complete freedom of movement. The 274th and 275th regiments, several thousand professional soldiers who knew every trail, every stream crossing, every village in the province. The dominant predators in their own ecosystem. Against them, in the deep jungle, the Australian Army deployed teams of 5 men. 5. And the Americans, watching Australian CS patrols disappear into the tree line with 2 weeks of rations and no heavy weapons and no armored support, reached for the only word the arithmetic seemed to support. Suicidal. The Australians walked into that jungle anyway, every time. For 4 years, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment was raised in 1957 at Campbell Barracks in Swanbourne, Western Australia, on a patch of coastal scrub that looked like the end of the world and smelled of salt and eucalyptus, modelled on the British SAS. But what it became was something the British SAS, for all its considerable achievements, had not quite been. The patrol was everything. 5 men. The number had been arrived at through the kind of experimentation that costs blood and then gets written into doctrine, because the men who survived agreed on what the experiment had proved. 4 was not enough. 6 left marks. 3 could not maintain a perimeter. 5 was the answer the jungle gave when asked. How many men can exist in this environment without becoming visible to the people who live in it? Selection process that produced SAS patrol members was not primarily physical, though the physical demands were extraordinary. It was psychological. The regiment wanted men who were comfortable being alone, not tolerant of solitude, constitutionally, genuinely comfortable with the state of making a decision in a place where the nearest friendly face was a day's walk away, and the radio might or might not work. The Australian outback produces this type in unusual numbers, for reasons anyone who has spent real time in it understands immediately. When the nearest help is 100 miles away, and the conditions are trying to kill you, you either develop a specific kind of self-reliance, or you stop being a problem for anyone. They wanted men who could think slowly under extreme pressure. The fast thinker in a jungle contact fires at a shadow and reveals his position. The slow thinker absorbs the information, filters it, identifies the 2 things that actually matter, and makes a decision that is 3 seconds slower than instinct demands and 30 times more likely to be correct. And they wanted men who were violent without anger. Anger is a performance. It requires energy and produces noise. The violence the SASR needed was the other kind. Cold, precise, applied without hesitation or emotion to the specific target that required it, and then turned off again, completely, immediately, like a light switch. When they deployed to Phuoc Tuy Province, they spent their initial weeks doing something no conventional unit was doing: learning. Not reading maps, walking, sitting in lay-up positions for 8 hours and listening. Building an internal model of how this specific piece of jungle worked, where the animals moved, how far sound carried on still mornings, what the absence of birdsong meant, and in which direction. They were doing what every hunter does when he enters new country, learning it before he asks anything of it. The NVA logistics courier never heard them. A 10-man resupply team moving along a secondary trail in the deep jungle. Experienced men who had made variations of this route dozens of times, moving correctly, proper intervals, proper noise discipline. 3 of them did not arrive at the destination cache. The 7 who did heard nothing before the contact and saw nothing during it. The follow-up investigation found 7 brass cartridge cases arranged in a grouping so tight that a dinner plate would have covered all of them. 7 rounds, 3 men down, no blood trail indicating withdrawal, no sign of the firing point having been occupied for more than the seconds required to fire. The NVA tracker assigned to the investigation found 4 boot impressions over 40 meters, traced them to a rocky stream bank, and lost them completely. His report noted, with professional precision and professional unease, the force responsible was very small. Smaller than any force that should have been capable of achieving this result. Dot across Phuoc Thai province, the pattern repeated. Courier teams vanished. Supply catches that should have been untouchable were destroyed. Communication relay points went silent. An EVA intelligence officer began constructing a map of incidents, connecting the locations with thread, standing back, looking at what the thread described. The damage was not random. It clustered along logistical routes, around junction points, around the approaches to staging areas. Whatever was doing this was observing before it struck, and it was moving through terrain the NVA had considered completely safe. He wrote in his assessment, "These are reconnaissance elements with offensive capability. They observe before they act. This makes them more dangerous than a patrol that only fights DOT." He was correct. He could not have known quite how correct DOT. The NVA had a word for what they had encountered, borrowed from a vocabulary that had nothing to do with military doctrine. Marung, forest ghosts. By mid-1968, NVA logistics personnel were refusing night movement on trails that had been safe the previous month. Patrols doubled and tripled in size, which made them larger, slower, and more visible to the air assets that the Australian observers were directing onto them. The more the NVA tried to protect themselves from the Marung, the more vulnerable they became to everything else. The NVA command adapted. They formed dedicated tracker teams, small, expert, single mission, go into the jungle and find the Australians before the Australians found them. It was the right response. Tactically, exactly the right response. The specific, lethal, catastrophic problem those tracker teams were about to discover was that the thing they had been sent to hunt had spent its entire operational existence preparing for precisely this moment. The Australian SAS had not only anticipated being hunted, it had built its contact drills around the assumption that being found and being killed were not the same event, provided the response was fast enough, violent enough, and moved in the direction that no rational person expected. Toward the hunter. Sergeant Bob Moger's patrol had been operational for 8 days when they understood where they were. Not adjacent to an NVA staging area. Inside one. The sign was everywhere once you knew how to read it. Trail compression patterns indicating heavy recent traffic. Vegetation cut at the height of a man carrying a weapon at the ready. A stream crossing where someone had carefully disguised entry and exit points well enough to fool a casual observer, but not an CSR point man, trained to look for exactly this level of care. McGuire called for extraction. 40 minutes. Standard procedure. The NVA tracker team found them at minute 12. Men. Part of the dedicated anti-CS element deployed for 3 months with one specific mission: locate and fix Australian patrols until a reaction force could arrive and destroy them. Their senior NCO had been tracking in this jungle for 6 years. He had followed the near-invisible sign of Muga's patrol for 4 hours. He had radioed for support, 2 additional sections converging from north and east. In 15 minutes, 36 soldiers around a 5-man patrol pinned against a stream bed, high ground on the south, the extraction point covered. He had time on his side and numbers on his side. He had never hunted Australians before. Mauger's radio operator passed the contact situation in the flat, controlled voice that SASR operators used on radio, because panicked voices deliver information badly, and information was the only thing that mattered now. Extraction aircraft rerouted. A pair of US Army Cobra attack helicopters alerted and moving. Estimated time to overhead, 23 minutes. 23 minutes. 12 NVA in direct contact, 36 arriving in 15. Mauger looked at the 5 men around him. 300 rounds per rifle. 1 M60 with 2 belts. 4 fragmentation grenades per man. 1 claymore, positioned that morning as standard precaution, oriented by coincidence toward the tracker team's exact axis of approach. He made the calculation. The same calculation SASR patrol commanders had been making for 3 years in this jungle, when waiting means being fixed, moving means surviving, regardless of which direction the movement goes. He pointed at the tracker team. Forward. Force. The claymore fired first. 700 steel balls in a 60-degree arc at 1 meter height, delivered into the position where the tracker team's forward elements had been consolidating. For 2 full seconds, the jungle went silent in the way that only a massive concussive event creates silence. Every creature within 200 meters suddenly still. Into those 2 seconds, all 5 Australians opened fire simultaneously. The M60 swept the most likely rally point, a large fallen tree that soldiers instinctively move toward when contact is initiated. Every round in the first belt went into that log and through it and into whatever was sheltering on the other side. The 4 SLRs worked the flanks in overlapping arcs so practiced they seemed mechanically coordinated rather than individually aimed. NEVA soldiers who survived described it uniformly as being struck by a force of 20 to 30 men from multiple directions. The idea that 5 men had produced that volume of fire was simply not something their experience of warfare had prepared them to accept. And then the Australians moved not back, not into cover, through the contact site, through the smoke and the silence where the tracker team had been, out the far side and moving fast, 600 meters in 11 minutes, because noise no longer mattered and distance was the only thing that did. The radio operator transmitted a contact report while running. The Cobra pilot later said it was the clearest situation brief he had received from a unit in active contact in his entire tour. Grid of friendly forces. Grid of enemy. Direction of enemy movement. Requested fire line 200 meters behind the patrol's axis. The Cobra rolled in. 6,000 rounds per minute at treetop height hit the pursuit axis exactly where directed. The NVA section gaining on the patrol encountered that wall and made the entirely rational decision to stop pursuing Moga's patrol, reached the extraction point at minute 19. All 5 men they used 3 minutes dressing 2 minor wounds. When the extraction helicopter landed, all 5 were standing at the clearing edge in a loose perimeter, weapons outward, every approach covered, calm with the specific calmness of men whose adrenaline has had 4 minutes to begin its long descent from maximum output. They loaded in order. The man with the arm wound first, always the most compromised man first. Not because he was more valuable, because that was how it was done. The helicopter lifted. Below them, an NVA regiment attempted to construct a coherent account of what had happened to its specialist tracker team. The regimental commander demanded a recount of casualties. The recount produced the same figures. The divisional intelligence assessment was updated within the week. Australian Special Forces units do not withdraw from contact. They attack through contact. Attempts to fix or corner these elements increase their lethality rather than reducing it. Recommend, do not attempt to corner. Withdraw before they detect observation. Every word was correct. And for the NVA, it was completely, permanently useless. You cannot develop a defensive doctrine against an enemy whose doctrine is to turn your defensive position into their attack vector. You cannot set a trap for people who treat the trap as their preferred point of engagement. You cannot hunt something that hunts back from closer than you knew it was before you knew it had seen you. The Australian SAS Regiment completed its Vietnam service in 1971. 4 years. More than 1,000 patrol missions across 5,000 square kilometers against an enemy that had been continuously at war since 1945 and had never been defeated by any force relying on conventional doctrine. The official statistics record 2 SAS-R soldiers killed in action during the entire Vietnam deployment. 2. The men came home to a country that was exhausted by the war and largely unprepared to receive them with what their service had earned. The SAS-R operators processed this the way they processed most things, without complaint and without performance. They went back to Swanbourne. They wrote their debrief reports. They trained the next intake. Some left the regiment and went back to wherever they had come from, the cattle stations, the coastal cities, the mining towns, and got on with whatever came next. They did not write memoirs. The culture that produced them had no tradition of the public accounting of private achievement. You did what was necessary. You looked after the man beside you. You came home. That was the complete transaction. The receipt was not something you waved around. But in the NVA's operational records, the Ma Rung appear across 4 years of entries in a way that tells a different story from any official account. They appear in damage assessments, in logistics disruption analyses, in the letters of complaint that field commanders sent to their superiors when supply deliveries failed for reasons that could not be satisfactorily explained. They appear as gaps, as absences, as the recurring negative space in an otherwise detailed record of NVA operations in Phuoc Thu province. The NVA was never broken. It fought for 25 years and it won, and it deserves the respect of anyone who examines that achievement honestly. But in Phuoc Thu province, in the specific and bounded world of their own deep jungle, The two regiments that had once operated there with absolute confidence began operating with a caution. Their commanders had never had to manage before dot. The fear that makes you take the longer route. That makes you double your security. That costs time and energy and confidence in steady, invisible increments until the cumulative cost becomes a tactical factor that shapes what your army will and won't attempt dot. The Americans brought 500,000 soldiers to Vietnam and could not make the NVA afraid of the jungle dot. The Australians sent 5 men at a time with 2 weeks of rations and rifles that had been in service since the Korean War, and made an army of tens of thousands afraid to move through their own territory after dark dot. That is not a footnote in the history of the Vietnam War dot. That is the lesson.